So I think this is one of the problems, is that it's so easy nowadays to avoid and turn away. And I like to think of it as, it's almost like our mental muscle. Either you can train it and you can train that mental muscle to turn that alarm down, or you train it to turn it up. And whenever we avoid things, we train to turn that alarm up because our brain goes, oh, we're avoiding this. This must actually be dangerous. It's hilarious because we think, and again, we think of the hard things as like, oh, I'm going to go, do this crazy exercise or, put myself through this miserable experience. And the hard thing is just literally doing nothing.
Hello and welcome to the Life Lessons podcast with me, Simon Mundie. This podcast has a simple mission: to have discussions that reveal something important about life and how best to live it. My guests range from the biggest sporting names on the planet through to neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists, and world-renowned thinkers. We talk about things like how to skillfully relate to uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, the power of acceptance and psychological flexibility, how to get your circadian rhythms in sync to feel your best, right through to the nature of reality. These conversations and the bite-sized episodes have the power to change your life. Alberto Salazar was once the most revered running coach in the world, leading athletes including Mo Farah to the very top of their game. But in 2019, Salazar was banned from athletics for violating anti-doping rules. This week's guest, Steve Magness, had worked alongside him at the Nike Oregon project, and he was the whistleblower whose claims were followed up by a BBC Panorama and Publica investigation, leading ultimately to Salazar's downfall. It's fascinating to hear Steve explain his role in what is a truly incredible tale. While he says being a whistleblower led to a traumatic 9-year period of his life, he says he doesn't regret it. And what he learned during that time informed his most recent book, called Do Hard Things. He busts myths around toughness and resilience. Toughness isn't about projecting confidence, for example. It's about uncovering authenticity. Steve encourages people to question what doing hard things really means. It's not just about the more obvious stuff like running marathons and taking ice baths, but about being authentic, having hard conversations, through to sitting still and doing nothing. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Steve, and I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. Steve Magness, what an absolute delight to have you on the show. Lovely to see your face. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks so much. Really looking forward to talking with you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. I've already told you this before we started recording, but I'll say it again. I'm a huge fan of yours for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that actually more specifically in a second. But, we are talking as well about your book, Do Hard Things, Why We Get Resilience Wrong and the Surprising Science of Real Toughness. And it really resonated hugely with me. I think rethinking hard things and examining why it's good to take the road less traveled in all its forms. Is that a fair sort of synopsis in one line?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to summarize a book in one line, but I think that does a good. I think the key is in all its forms, which brings like the nuance of it. You're not just saying like, go down this path that looks horrible all the time. You're saying, there's a lot of paths, like figure it out,
Yes. And I know this is your 4th book.
Yes.
Crikey. I mean, that's doing hard things a lot, Steve. I know you've got a masochistic streak with your running, but that's a hell of an output you've got there. And they're hard things books.
Yeah, no, books are not the funnest. They're fun at first until you get into the weeds. It kind of is like running, where you sign up for the race, you're like, this is great. And then you get in the middle of it and you're like, why in the world did I do this? So I think there is a little of that masochistic. Maybe as my running, it has gone down a little bit. It's the book writing that fulfills that, maybe.
Absolutely. And actually, it's interesting. I was reflecting on running. So I don't run as much as I would like because I've got a bit of a gammy hip and I've had knee surgery. But when I do run, I don't run with music and I don't run with headphones or anything like that. And I've realized when reflecting, I was thinking about it after reading your book or while reading your book. And what I love about running, actually, and I think I said this to a friend of mine recently, he was like, I hate running.
I'm like, yeah, but that's kind of the point for me, is like the pain is actually where the good stuff is. Because if I go for a run and I put myself through pain, yeah, you get the hormone release and all that stuff, and it clears the head. I don't think there's anything better. But actually, that sense of satisfaction of having not given in to that whining voice in the head saying, please stop, just stop. Why don't you stop here? That is where the beauty of it is for me.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. You know, I always tell people, I said, well, running is like, it's you alone in your head dealing with the barrage of like emotions and thoughts and that voice telling you to quit or find a hole to step in or whatever it is, right? And you have to navigate it. And there are so few moments in the rest of our life where we just have to kind of go through that difficult part. Like everything else we can kind of say like, oh no, I'm gonna avoid this, or like I'm just gonna make this a little bit easier and more comfortable. And I think that's part of it, is there's something valuable of just going through those moments and being like, all right, like we got to figure this out. And when you get on the other side, it does give you that satisfaction. And I think it also kind of trains that mental muscle where you can take that to other aspects of your life.
100%. I know I've had a good start to the day if I have a run followed by meditation, just follow the breath, because that's also hard. And then I'll hop in a cold bath after a shower. That's my little thing. I get a buzz on there. I know then I've done 3 quote unquote hard things, and the day is bound to sort of unfold more often than not in a positive manner thereafter.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And you know, it's interesting. The hopping and the cold plunges have kind of taken off recently. And I'm convinced that the reason isn't like necessarily any physiological thing. I think it's basically because it's hard. It sucks to jump in that every morning or like go in that. Your brain's like, get me out of here. What are you doing? And I think there's just something so, yes, there's physiology to it, but I think there's something just so simple and important in setting up the day where it's like, okay, I went through something. Like now I can like have this energy to take to the other projects or other things that matter in my life.
So things like that are some of the more obvious hard things. But then there's the whole other side. And for me, there are things like, you know, having hard conversations is a great one. And this is where I want to just bring in your story a bit, because I think taking a decision, a very moral decision, in the face of people, your own family, lawyers saying, Steve, don't do this, don't do this. And of course, you know, I'm referring to you being the guy who called out Alberto Salazar, and I've forgotten the name of it. The
Nike Oregon project.
The Nike Oregon project, yeah. So Alberto obviously considered to be, for a while, this magician athletics trainer, and then it turned out perhaps it was a little more nefarious and underhand than that. Actually, after reading your book, I watched some stuff around Mary Kane and the abuse stuff. Truly shocking stuff. A really dark way of operating. And you were a young guy. You were, like mid-20s. You'd been this promising young runner. And then Alberto had got in touch and said, come hang with me at this stage. You're like, hey, dream job. And then in time, you're like, actually, whoa, there's some dodgy stuff going on here. And maybe if you want to pick up the story at this point, because maybe from what was the first recognition through to the time where you thought, okay, I can't ignore my conscience. I've got to do the right thing, which is the hard thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you set it up well, because you go in with the idea that it was my dream job. It was like I hit the lottery. And what happens because of that expectation is you start seeing things, or I started seeing things where I'm like, oh, hold on a minute. Like, you know, this is a little bit sketchy. Like, why are we trying to fool doctors to get asthma medication? Or why are we trying to, like, why is Alberto handing out, you know, prescription medications to people who haven't been prescribed them, you know, and just things like that where it's just like a little weird. And what you do is you just kind of rationalize and justify in the moment. You're just like, well, you know, maybe he has this, and this reason. And that's what you do at first. And it's really weird looking back, because we like to think of things as, oh, like it's black and white. I'm either like this moral, ethical person or I'm not. And if I see something, I'm going to say something. But the reality of life is often much messier. So initially it was all that, until over time, what happened is more and more things came up. And there was, injection of substances. There was, treatment of athletes. This is all widely documented, but treatment of athletes and just crazy stuff. I remember, maybe one story to get to your listeners, which was right before I left, is I remember after a World Athletics Indoor Championship, and we're having kind of a review after the meet, the competition, on how athletes did. And Alberto's talking about one athlete who made their first World Championship team. And all of a sudden, he just goes on this rant of like, she's too fat, like her ass is too big, like blah, blah, blah. She needs to lose weight. And I'm just like, I'm looking at this and I'm a data science guy. So I'm like, well, we have all this data. Like, let me look at her, like legitimate in the Nike lab, like scientific body fat testing. And it's at like the lowest level that you could be a female without being essentially in a bad spot health-wise. Crazy low body fat. And I like point this out. I'm like, well, here's the data. And it says this. And he's like, I don't give a damn what the data says. I know what I see with my eyes. And I'm just like, okay, like we've crossed the world into where, some person's perception is more important than just like what is black and white, what is truly black and white data. And I remember that, like, those were the kind of moments where I'm just like, holy crap, what have we been doing? What have, I been pushed through to do? And it was kind of a light bulb moment of like, okay, I need to get out of here first. And your instinct, again, after you get out of here, you say, well, where do you get this moral decision? Your instinct after you get out of there is like, I want nothing to do with this. Like, I don't want to ruin my life. Like, let me just get out of here. I don't forget everything. But then over time, what happens is underneath, there's just this like underlying current that is like eating you away and being like, well, should you say something? What you experienced was not right. Like, it crossed some boundaries and some lines and some anti-doping lines. And everybody around me, it was telling me like, just move on. Like, get done. And for rightful reason.
Including your family, right? Including your parents.
Yeah, and my parents. And they were trying to, well, why would they tell that? It's not that they're immoral people. It's they were trying to protect you. Because it's like, they're just like, dude, do you want to take on like this big organization and this like legend in sport? You are essentially a nobody. You're going to get railroaded because that's what our society is, unfortunately, a lot of times. So they were telling me to stay quiet, but eventually, again, it was kind of, I remember the moment actually pretty clearly is other people were starting to join the project after I'd left, including, there were talks of, I don't remember the timeline exactly, but Mary Kane joining. And at that time, she was like 16, 17 years old.
So just for a quick bit of context, because obviously she's not as well known over here, but she was like this prodigy runner, the best runner in America of her age. Like, great things could have come of her, right?
Yeah, exactly. She is like the superstar, for you guys, that footballer who you look at 16, 17, who is just like, oh my gosh, this is the next Lionel Messi or whoever it is. That was her kind of performance, like once in a generation. I remember hearing, okay, she's going to join. And I just remember thinking like, oh my dear God, like this is the worst match ever. Like, this is a 16-year-old, 17-year-old girl who's just has no idea what she's getting into. And situations like that where I was just like, I just got to talk. This is eating away at me, because if I don't say anything, I'm going to feel so guilty. If I do say anything, bad stuff might happen to me, but at least people will know. And at least people will can make a decision, versus when I went into it, like, I had no idea. I thought I was hitting the dream job. And I'm like, I'm sure all these other people who are put in that situation think the same way. So at least I'm going to put it out there. And that's kind of, I did it without telling anybody. And I just reached out to, in the US, is US Anti-Doping. And I said, here's what I experienced. Here's some info. if you want to follow it up, like, I'm here to talk. And of course they called me up and were like, well, let's hear everything. So that's how it started down that journey.
Just a quick on Mary Kane. Like I said, I watched a video and she's done this 4 or 5 minute video where she talks about her experience, and it is truly horrifying because she was pestered around her weight and was just so thin. Her period stopped for a couple of years. She started self-harming. She spoke about having suicidal thoughts. It was seriously disturbing. And so we all, I think, want to think that in those kind of situations, we would do the hard thing, which is the right thing. But actually, very few people would. And so that's part of the reason I so admire what you did do, going up against a giant, proper David v. Goliath stuff. Can you just tell me, like, when it did blow up? Because I know it went on for a long time. You're still in your 20s, right? And as far as I'm concerned, when you're in your 20s, you're young, you're not, I certainly wasn't fully matured. And so I know that you had people trying to intimidate you and come into your house. I mean, how did you cope throughout that period, and how long did it go on for?
Yeah, so it went on from the moment that I blew the whistle until it finally ended. It took 9 years.
Wow.
And that is not something I expected, but it was tough to cope with because you're right. Like, I remember when it first blew up, I mean, I had people come into my house. I remember I had to look out the windows and everything to make sure that I could pull my car out and go to work without a reporter or whoever. I had people that show up to my work at that time. I had people when I went to, I was coaching athletics at that point. So I'd show up to track meets and I'd get, intimidated by random people would just come up to me, and people at Salazar came up to me once, Nike came up to people would come up to me. And it was just, intimidation. I mean, one time, the probably surrealist moment was I was backing out of my car and 2 guys in suits tap on my car window, and it's literally the FBI. And in my head, I'm just like, what is this? Am I in a movie? Like, this is nuts. And then you have to go through all sorts of arbitration and horrible, you just get grilled for hours by everybody. So it sucked. And it was not easy. In a lot of ways, it felt like a part of, I had to compartmentalize it, because you're right. In your 20s, you're not a child, but you're still clueless and you still have a lot of times no perspective on life. So I had to compartmentalize on okay, here's my actual life over here. And then here's this thing that is just going to be underlying that I'm going to go through for the foreseeable future. And it's always going to be a stressor. And I have to do my best to kind of contain it in this box, because if I let it infiltrate everything else, I'm going to be miserable. So it was tough, because every decision I made, every decision from especially with work, I remember being 27, 28, working at a university and being like, if I ever want to move, every job interview I got or whatever, I'd have to be like, okay, well, I have to tell you about this thing that is still going on, because, I'm going to get pulled away and have to leave, or have to fly across.
The FBI might be coming around.
Right. There were little moments where I'm going to have to miss work because I have to go in and get interviewed by the FBI. But those are the things. And you just have to hope that your boss or whoever is understanding in those moments. Those were the conversations. So every aspect of my life is it's whenever we had a new boss at the university in charge of stuff, I remember being and it happened 3 or 4 times while I was there for the decade. And I'd be like, all right, I got to go in and have this conversation with this guy and explain this crazy thing and just hope they get it. And every time it was wild.
When you were going through the rough times, and, you said it was 9 years and you've got the FBI knocking on your window and everything like that, were you sustained that whole time by the knowledge that, from a conscientious point of view, from a morality point of view, you were doing what in your heart you knew to be right, despite the difficulty?
So that thought was always present and always something that I went back to. But much like we talked about in running, I'll use this analogy, is you know that maybe you signed up for the race and it's a good thing that you're doing, but that negative voice is always present. So during those times, there were some moments, and it's sometimes some dark moments, where it's just like, okay, I know I did this for the right reasons and this is going to help, but you're just like, hell, this sucks. This is ruining X, Y, and Z. Is this really worth it? You know, that's where it becomes difficult. That's where the tough moments would lie, is your life kind of felt chaotic and at times lost, because I can look back now because it's over and say, well, it took 9 years. But when I'm in year 5 and I'm like, it's taken 5 years, it's still going through it. When is this going to end? I'm ready to move on with the next chapter of my life and not have to think about this like always present in my world. Those moments, some of those were not fun and dark, and your mind goes to a bad place.
So when it eventually got to that point where you were vindicated and Salazar was exposed and then later exposed again, he was first done from a doping point of view and then later from an abuse point of view, more recently, in fact. But when he was initially exposed, how did you feel at that point?
So a lot of people have asked me this, and they always think like, oh, you probably feel like vindicated and overjoyed or whatever. And honestly, it was just relief. I was just like, okay, things turned out. I am done. I can now finally close this chapter of my life in terms of like actively participating in it. I don't mind talking about it, but like in terms of actively thinking about this and just having that little voice in the back of your head of like, well, what's going to happen? Well, what if this? What if that? And again, it was kind of like a weight came off my shoulder where I'm like, okay, I don't have to carry this burden anymore. It's off me.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that that whole experience as well changed your values? Because I know that, you know, you were a competitive runner. I know when you were young, you were like trying to break the mythical 4-minute mile. And I know now that you run not to compete, but just for the joy of running. And actually, this is something I bang on about a bit, is we all get into sport or our favorite sport or music or art or whatever it is because we love it. And it's only later that competing in the trophies and the becoming a winner comes a thing. And it's like you've gone full circle back to that, just loving it for its own sake and seeing through the kind of illusion of it's about trophies, it's about aggrandizing your image and all that crap.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a perfect analogy. It's just, as I have come full circle, and I'll admit it, absolutely. At certain points in my life, like that competing, that winning was almost the only thing, right? And what you quickly realize is that it's almost kind of like all a facade, right? Especially having gone through this, I'm like, well, legitimately, growing up, Alberto Salazar was probably a hero of mine. Like, I read all his books and like all the articles and like knew his career inside and out because he was just this famous runner who was just so tough and would run himself almost to death. And you like look up to that as a young runner. But having gone through this, what it really makes you realize is like all the accolades, achievements, the success, the quote unquote success, that's all superficial kind of BS. Yeah, sure, it can feel good, but is it what really matters? What I'm saying is like, not like, hey, forget all the success, but from what I found is if you focus on that joy and love of the thing and almost take that craftsman-like approach where I just love doing this, then success will probably find you in some way because like you're doing good work because you enjoy it. I mean, it's no different than writing. Like, I don't write to make some bestseller list. I'm just like, this is an interesting topic. I want to explore it. Like, let's write about it and figure it out. And if you do that and you enjoy it, like the success will come.
Yeah, totally. A friend of mine tweeted something like, if you could share any message to children, what would it be? And my response is along this theme, which is that to understand that your worth is intrinsic, you know, actually peace is your nature, and therefore life can become an expression of that rather than a search for it. And I think that's kind of what you're saying there, isn't it? It's like if you do what you love, yeah, success may be a byproduct, probably will. You know, we know that when we're relaxed and in the flow and all that, you know, we play better, for example, at sport. But, you know, you're coming from a place of wholeness and sharing that rather than seeking for the trophies to fill that hole, which even if you get the trophy, you'll never do it.
Exactly. You're spot on there. And I think, whenever I have conversations like this, I go to there's this wonderful research that shows essentially where you go into that seeking mode and that filling hole mode, what it does is it makes your identity fragile because you are dependent on success, achievement, those trophies or whatever to feel whole. There's some wonderful research that shows when people go in that spot, they are more likely to cheat. They are more likely to use performance-enhancing drugs in sport. They're more likely to bend rules. Why? Because they feel they need to fill that hole so badly that they're willing to throw out all of their ethics and morals because they're just like, this is the key. And inevitably what happens is they sometimes reach that goal, maybe like a Lance Armstrong who, won so many Tour de France's, and then they realize, hey, this doesn't make me feel content. I'm still kind of miserable trying to chase this thing. It's almost like that never-ending drug they're always searching for.
Absolutely. I always wonder if Lance, he always wanted to get found out, but that's a whole other thing. But so many people build up, don't they, this kind of persona in their own heads, their own self-image, and then how they're perceived by others, and then maintaining this image that is ultimately a complete fiction, rather than, like you say, finding that kind of unshakable piece, if you like, within, which is there, and then just expressing it in, you run, that's your thing. However you want to express that, that's fine, but come from that place. Right, final question on this, Steve, before we leap into your book. And the book and your experiences, it just struck me how closely linked they are. But my final question on this would be, to what degree has your view of athletics and sports been tarnished? Because Salazar's obviously taken a hit, but there are a lot of people who there's still a cloud of suspicion over it, and I'm sure you probably know a lot more, and I'm not going to press you for that, but I am going to press you for what's your view of sport as a result, an elite sport?
Yeah, you're right. It does kind of tarnish and cloud your view, because if you aren't aware, it can make you deeply pessimistic, because you can be like, well, is what I'm watching real or not? Or is this all kind of fake? And what I've tried to do, because I love athletics, I love sport as a whole, is I've tried to say, you know what, I'm just going to take the good bits and the bits that I feel good at, that I feel pretty confident in, and cheer and watch for those, and those that I don't feel good about and that maybe have some controversy around them, or just, honestly, sometimes it's even this just doesn't feel real. Then I just, ignore that part. And I'm lucky that I'm a little bit on the inside, but you learn over time kind of who are the good athletes or coaches or the good, the people doing it the right way. I support and cheer for and celebrate those people as a fan, and the people who maybe are in kind of a little bit sketchier situations or camps or groups or have shown, I don't know, some signs of something. Then I just say, you know what, I'm just not going to give you much attention. And if you do something great, whatever, it doesn't bring me any joy as a fan, I'm just going to wait to the next race. So that's kind of how I handle it. It's not perfect, but I think it's my way to keep from going totally pessimistic and being oh, this race is meaningless or what have you, because so-and-so is part of a sketchy group and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think, people who perhaps are engaged in nefarious means and perhaps are lying outwardly and to themselves, you spoke about the weight coming off your shoulders. They must sense that too. I remember watching a clip once about infidelity. And it was someone who cheats on their partner, they're going to pay in one form or other. Their partner might not know, but you're going to pay in one form or other, maybe, in true intimacy or been out of sleep well at night, and so, but anyway, you've got to make your bed and lie in it. So to go from Alberto to this book, it was ringing somewhat in my mind what you went through, because you start the book talking about the tyrant leader, the guy who, or the woman who will come in and be like, right, I know best, you do this, you do that, and by the way, I'm going to be looking over your shoulder, and if you don't do it, you're out in your ear. So kind of that fear-based thing. We all know leaders like that. You know, I've certainly experienced that and how demoralizing it can be, as opposed to real leadership or real strength, which is hard, which is to empower people and create an environment in which actually you're allowing people to flourish and step up and be their best self, which means you've got to not put yourself up on that big pedestal like an Alberto did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's it's funny. I don't write about the my experience or Alberto in this book, but his influence and the influence of it rings through.
The shadow of his own. Yeah, I could sense that.
Yeah. So, and I did that intentional because I started writing this book before the other thing was actually finished. So I was like, I'm not touching it. But you're right, and I think so much what we do is we have this misconception where we almost hold up these kind of authoritarian leaders as like, oh, well, they have a lot of power and control and they're tough or whatever have you. So maybe this way is the way to do it. But if you look at the research and then you look at actual people's experience, you ask them and you say like, well, do you perform your best when you are like afraid of your boss and afraid of doing the wrong thing or afraid of, if you mess up in any way, it could be fired? Of course not. Like 99% of people don't. And the research backs this up. What it really is how do I create the environment where people have the freedom to perform and to utilize their skills? And what the research kind of shows clearly is it's not like, hey, I'm going to be totally soft and a player's coach or whatever have you, however you want to say it. It's accompanying, maybe some high expectations, but having enough support and responsiveness and care and melding those two that really gets you the good stuff. And I think far too often what we do is we just forget that support, care, responsiveness, and that puts us in a bad spot.
Just as you were saying that, it made me think actually of parenting. Behaving like that, A, is not right, and B, is not going to serve you in the long run. So holding them to a standard, but doing it with a sense of, by the way, there's nothing you can do that can stop me loving you, It's that amalgamation, right?
Right, exactly. This is why I love the research and the understanding of parenting, because it is that. It's like the person needs to know, well, why does that work as a parent? Because the kid knows that, like, no matter what, I love you, support you, and want the best for you. And that is where this maybe sometimes like this telling you not to do something or directing you in this way that, maybe you don't feel good about as a kid. The reason that's coming from a place of, I love and support you and want the best for you. Well, the same thing applies in leading, coaching for executives is maybe it's not love, but it's, I see you more than just a cog in the wheel. You are a person that I value, and I want you to grow with this company as well. And I value that growth. This is why maybe I'm giving you criticism or feedback or what have you. It's not because you're just another number and I don't care and I can get rid of you at all points. And the interesting part is there, to tie it back to that parenting, is if you don't have that kind of responsiveness, support, care, etc., is the kind of high expectations, dictatorial kind of style backfires on everything that you think it would work in. Discipline is worse. Emotional control is worse. Why? Simple. Because if you're kind of that authoritarian, the child learns like, okay, I'm going to avoid doing this stuff when mom or dad is around, but I'm going to figure out a way how to get around this, so that I can still be who I am and live my life or what have you. So they're actually just learning avoidance instead of having to deal with or navigate maybe criticism or critique or whatever it is.
Yeah, well said. So you come up with these 4 core pillars related to doing hard things, and we'll dig through them. And the first one, ditching the facade, embracing reality. And you talk about this persona that everyone has to a degree, right? We all walk around with this mask that we wear, and the firmer you grasp that mask, the worse it's going to be when it slips, right? So yeah, you carve this nice thing, don't you? Is understand what you're capable of, and also understand what the demands of something are going to be. So could you just try to explain that better than I could, and then let's dig into it a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on that mask, one of my good friends who's in the military put it best. He said, like, whenever stress and reality smacks you in the face, that mask is going away. And that's true. It's like whenever you put through something really stressful, like you can't hold on to that mask. It's like whoever you are underneath is coming out. And that kind of is what it is instead of focusing on like, well, let's create this external bravado in this mask and I look tough and strong and like deal with yourself, the inner strength and what you're kind of capable of. And that's where I get to this kind of formula, I guess is what I would say is we really need overlap between your perception of what you're capable of. So knowing your skills, knowing what you can handle, knowing that you know how to cope with things versus the demand that you're facing. And we don't need it perfectly overlapped, but we need some reality in there where it's like, okay, I'm going to have to give this big presentation or, I'm going to have to enter this race. Well, I'm capable of this because I've done the work, because I've put in the hours, because I've practiced or prepared or what have you. So I don't know if I'm going to win or not. I don't know if I'm going to, knock it out of the park or not. But I know that I am capable of, X, and I know that the task is Y. And there's enough overlap where I can feel like I can take that step and really push forward. And where we go wrong is where we try and just kind of bolster our sense of self by just like external fake stuff and be like, I got this, no problem. It's like the kid who shows up for the game and says like, oh, I'm the best soccer player ever. I've got this. I'm a great athlete. And they haven't practiced, where they're going to get schooled by someone who has less talent but has put in the work. The same goes for the rest of our life, is that we want that overlap so that we don't kind of spiral to freak out once reality smacks us in the face.
So you say something, don't you, about confidence is quiet and insecurity is loud, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, and we all kind of know this, and you see this online as well, as the people who yell the loudest are often the most insecure. Why? Because they're trying to essentially prove to themselves like, oh, I am confident, I do this, got this. The people who know, and I've seen this so often in athletics and sport, is like, when you know what you're capable of, you're just like, yeah, this is going to be tough, but like, I know what I can do. I don't need to tell you what I can do. I know when I get on the starting line, I'm capable of this. And I think that's what you see with the rest of life, is that those who have that kind of quiet, secure confidence, they're not trying to prove to the rest of the world because they know themselves. They're like, I put in the work. I can do this. I can show up.
And you talk about, I don't know if this is a direct quote, but certainly this is something that's started to be about true confidence being around acceptance. So a quote that I quite like, this isn't from your book, around never defend yourself, right? So let's say someone says, you suck at cooking, right? And instead of going, no, how dare you? It's like, you're damn right. I'm worse than bad. When there's nothing to bash up against, it just passes right on through. Now, obviously, we don't know this as a youngster, but it relates, I think, to, as someone else once said to me, getting secure with your insecurities. Because once you're okay with your demons and your insecurities, which we all have, because we're all conditioned by experience and society and all this stuff, then you're pretty much bulletproof. Embrace your warts and all, and that's where confidence is, paradoxically.
Exactly. I love that example and that quote because it's spot on. And if you even look at some of the psychology and neuroscience, it shows the same thing. Like, whenever we resist something, it comes back tenfold. Whenever we resist something, what we're signaling is the brain is like, oh, look at this. Like, I'm getting defensive. This must mean that, like, this is important to me. You get stuck in kind of this threat or defend mode instead of this kind of like, well, you know what, accept, let it pass on by, world's not going to end. And what happens too often is we get in those situations where we just get in defend mode. What we're doing is we're kind of defending our sense of self and our identity. And you see this again with any hot button, conversation, is like, people defend it to the death because their literal area in their brain that is like the threat detecting machinery, like goes through the roof. It treats us as if we were in physical danger, as if a lion was coming up on us when someone tells us like our cooking sucks, or that like, you know, whatever it is, we're horrible at it. And we're like, no, we're not, because like we're feeling attacked. Well, the way to do that isn't to, you know, defend. It's to turn that alarm down by being like, whatever, like you can tell me my cooking stuff sucks, like it probably does, but it's not like a central part of who I am as a person. Like there's space between that, you know? Whatever, like you can tell me my cooking stuff sucks, like it probably does, but it's not like a central part of who I am as a person. Like there's space between that, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. It made me think there's a thing going on social media and more broadly at the moment around, like, who's the greatest tennis player of all time? Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, and you've got your people in each camp, and they argue viciously, right? And it's bound up in their identity. My identity is I support this guy, and so it feels like an existential threat when their belief, i.e. a thought about who is the best, is challenged, even though it's got absolutely nothing to do with them. You know, when you look at it in the cold light of day, it's a sort of form of insanity, really. And identity is something that crops up occasionally in this, and this is a subject that I find sort of really interesting, and how it relates to the ego and the beliefs and all that kind of stuff. But so what is your take on then, I know you talk about secure but flexible, but identity, and how to, from your point of view, manage it or do whatever you need to do to be as secure as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that example because it's like such a meaningless argument, but people take it so real, and that applies to everything. So here's what I think on identity, okay? What we need is, like, as you kind of said there, secure but flexible. What does that mean? It means the moment you start responding in an argument, or whenever someone like makes a comment or whatever on something that is important to you, if you go straight to that defense mode, that means whatever that thing is probably too large a part of your sense of self. And we need to create space between that. Even on the things that we like love and care about, you know, the things that we do, like me as a writer, or you in speaking, whatever it is, like, yes, they are central to us, but they can't be the only thing. So step one, I think, is creating a little space between who you are and what you do. And then the other thing that I think is really important from my identity standpoint is, like, diversify those sources of self and meaning. And I love this quote from the Stanford neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky, who essentially said with identity, and he was talking about status, he said, it's part of being humans. We all need status. We all need to feel like, you know, our sense of self is bolstered. But he said the wonderful thing is we can get that from anywhere. So his quote was kind of like, you can get that from being the star lawyer in your office, or you can get the same literal biological effect by, instead of being the star in the office, being the star on the company softball team. And what I love about that is, it is like, we think that we have to have like this grand, big whatever, but to me, it's like, with your sense of self, is have a lot of things in your life that have some sort of meaning and purpose, and bring you maybe a little bit of status, so that when someone says like, you know, Steve, you know, you're a horrible writer, I can be like, okay, like, that's, you know, that's fine, but like, you know, it's not entirely who I am, because I also have all these other things that mean a lot to me in life, and I have all these other pursuits. So if you want to think I'm a horrible writer, that's no big deal. That's fine. No, not a problem.
I mean, that's where we want to get to, isn't it? Where, let's say, our sense of self almost can't be threatened. And this is one of those and moments I mentioned earlier in that around identity, is that I completely agree. You know, it's like we have these pillars of interest, things that we value, things that are important to us, all that kind of stuff. Things we like to do, skills, ways of looking at the world, whatever. But I would even argue, though, and this has been a bit of a journey, a big journey that I've been on, it is actually around just challenging this whole idea of needing an identity full stop. Now, what I mean by that is I look at my cats, right, and they strut around and, you know, they are as chilled and as secure as anyone I know. But obviously they don't have that self-concept that we do. And we put such stock in our self-image, our self-concept, our idea of ourselves, which is born obviously of the things we do, but also the beliefs we have. And so many different things come together, you know, a mixture of thoughts and feelings and all that kind of stuff. But all I would argue is that, and I think this relates a little bit to self-talk as well, which I know you talk about. This isn't to disagree at all, because there's just different ways of looking at these things. But the voice in our head that comes up, whether it goes, hey, you're great, high self-esteem, or you suck, low self-esteem, that voice is still not who we are, whether it's good or bad. And obviously it's nicer that it's good, but if it's bad, it's actually two sides of the same coin. Because, and a little thought experiment is, you know, if you have a quiet mind for 5 seconds, that's you. You're like, yeah, that's me. And then the voice comes up and goes, oh, Annie, I haven't said anything in a while. And then goes away again and you got 5 seconds and that's still you. It's like, well, so what does that imply about the voice? It implies that you're there without the voice. Therefore, like the ego, which is where we get our identity, is not fundamental to who we are. That doesn't mean we don't need it to operate in the world, but actually, it's not actually who we are. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, what you're essentially describing, if I think I'm hearing you right, is almost like the Buddhist idea of non-self, that the self is like essentially a delusion. And I think there's a lot of value and truth to that. And I would agree, where I tried to come from this in terms of especially those voices in your head is like the Western idea is if you walked around and you told people like, hey, there's no self, most people in the West will be like, what are you talking about, man? Like, what are you talking about? So a big part is like, well, and I'm, you know, I get it. I come from the West. I've studied Buddhism a little bit, but I'm no expert. But it's like, so you meet people where you're at. So I think part of it is like, yes, in an ideal world, do we move towards a non-self idea? Probably. I mean, there's probably a lot of good data that shows that like that would probably make us a healthier, happier, not as crazy human being. Is that realistic for most people in the West? I don't know yet because of cultural stuff. But one thing I would say is you can get at these ideas. And this is, you know, I was talking to a good friend who essentially said, you know, your book is kind of like, it underlies a lot of Buddhist principles that are hidden in non-Buddhist language. I would agree with that because like there's other ways we can frame this. For instance, on the self-talk, instead of seeing it as like no self whatsoever, maybe a more hospitable take for someone in the West is to say, hey, you've got all these voices and they all represent like very different, like tiny little fractions of yourself, which means like, you don't have, like, not all of them are valid. Like, some of them are like your, you know, crazy aunt or uncle who rants on Facebook. Some of them are just like that hyperactive self that is just like, I'm afraid of everything and I'm going to let Steve know that there's danger everywhere, where we know, like, you know, okay, like, overactive, you know, child self, like, just calm the F down. And I think, again, that's a different way that doesn't quite get it at the same way, but maybe might be a little bit more palatable to some people. So to me, it's like, I'm all about, you know, kind of, okay, if the goal is here to get people to deal with their inner world a little bit better, how do we just like give them lots of different tools to just like, let's nudge you this way instead of shooting perfection. Let's like get you away from maybe the Western model of like that facade, the Instagramification of self, and towards something that is a little bit more healthy and valuable.
Steve, that was a quite beautiful answer, by the way. That was so well put, I think. I love your idea of meeting people where they're at and trying to nudge people along the spectrum. But that leads me on. So just in terms of going towards discomfort, this is such a valuable thing. And perhaps we've spoken about it, whether it be in terms of you leaning into, okay, I'm going to ignore my lawyer and my parents and take on one of the biggest companies in the world and this legend through to all its forms. But so you say that the emotions we feel, they're messages and we get to decide how to react to them. Can you just talk a little bit about this? Because I think this is so important in this day and age, particularly when young people, I think, are so prone to turning away from discomfort and how problematic that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of the problems, is that it's so easy nowadays to avoid and turn away. And what we see is that I like to think of it as it's almost like our mental muscle. Either you can train it and you can train that mental muscle to turn that alarm down, or you train it to turn it up. And whenever we avoid things, we train to turn that alarm up because our brain goes, oh, we're avoiding this. This must actually be dangerous. And if we do that enough, well, all of a sudden you're scared to death of approaching anybody else in a line. Or with younger people who I talk to, like sometimes they're scared to death of like making phone calls because they've avoided it all their life. And it's easier to text than to make that call. Well, I'm all about, okay, we got to train that mental muscle to show us that we're okay. And the way to do that is embracing discomfort. And one of the key things to do that is to, like, instead of feeling those emotions that tell you like, hey, turn around, get away from this moment, etc., instead of like seeing those in the negative light, is seeing them as like, hey, this is just my body warning me that like, here, I'm doing something that is a little outside of the norm. So I can either pay attention to it, I can either heed its warning, or I have the choice and freedom to say, you know what, thanks for the message, but I'm still going to go through with this because, it's not actually that dangerous, or this means a lot to me, so I'm going to continue forward.
Yeah. So you spoke about Alex Honnold in your book, and I had the pleasure of having Alex on actually very shortly after Free Solo had come out. So people didn't realize who he was, and he was walking through the BBC, and I was like, guys, you don't realize this guy has really done something impressive. They were having photos actually with people from Strictly Come Dancing at the time, and I was like, wrong crowd. Anyway, I had Alex on, and we spoke about fear, and he said, a really valuable question to ask yourself is, am I actually in danger? We're so rarely in danger. Well, maybe sometimes we are when we don't realize it, but more often than not, certainly compared to the mythical yesteryear of cavemen and saber-toothed tigers and all that stuff. But, asking yourself that question, and then when you realize, okay, my body's not in danger, I'm not doing anything wrong, often then for me, when those feelings of anxiety or discomfort come up, it can actually be a call to, hey, here's a chance to lean into that and expand my comfort zone and grow. So just to give a quick example, because it's easy to speak from our age, but with our little girl, I'm always, without going overboard, trying to just push her into, lean into the discomfort and welcome that feeling. Make friends with that feeling. Because what might have been back in the day before phones and all that, when we were queuing and we had to just queue, or when we were waiting for a train and we just had to sit there, these feelings, we weren't so able to distract ourselves. What might have been back then just a sort of normal feeling of nervousness now is serious anxiety. So I'm like, no, turn towards it and embrace it and lean into it, because that's actually where the growth is.
And I'm glad you brought up, and this is often people think like big stressors and all that, but it's really the small stuff. You just mentioned there, it's like, it's standing in a line and being okay with being bored instead of giving into that anxiety and grabbing your phone and starting to scroll, because like that will soothe that anxiety or stress. So it really is we can either, become friends with our inner world, or we can make it kind of almost as if it's a foreign object. And I think too often when we avoid, it becomes this foreign thing where it's like, uh-oh, here's some stress, here's some anxiety, like go in the other direction. And I love that you're doing that with your kid, because like so often early on, we teach kids to kind of avoid because we just repeatedly tell them all the dangers that are in the world, and from a point of protection. But what they do is they learn like, oh, well, anything that causes threat, I'm going to avoid, instead of, maybe exploring it or sitting with it or whatever have you.
That leads us into part 4, the difference between responding and reacting. And actually, you give that example of, which relates to this, of people, if they're stuck in a room on their own, like how it's torture, right? And there's that famous quote, I can't remember who said it, you know, all the problems of man could be solved if you could sit in a room with no distractions. And this is why, and you talk about meditation, you talk about altered traits. I spoke to Daniel Goleman about this, big fan of his. And this is, I think, for me, why meditation is so valuable is it's not, I'm trying to get anywhere. This sort of idea of clearing your mind is actually just getting comfortable being. And actually what I've noticed now is, in the West, we're such a culture of doing, aren't we? Of you feel guilty if you sit on your backside for 5 minutes, right? But the more and more, and I think this comes from training that muscle through meditation, through sitting on trains and just staring out of windows or whatever it may be. I love just sitting there doing nothing. And in time, you can go from having your internal world, as you put it, being this scary, boring, terrible place to actually, you realize that is where the peace is. And until you turn around, you're missing that. And not only that, it's kind of tormenting you.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it right there. And I'm in 100% agreement, because what happens is we kind of live in a reactive world where we're like the dog who sees a squirrel and just, you know, going from squirrel to squirrel and going crazy with our head. Well, that's what happens here, is that instead of being able to kind of just sit with who we are and our being and, you know, the world that is going by, we just always look for the shiny objects. And that trains our brain to literally be stressed out, because it is always looking for something better to do. Why? Because we've trained it to look for something better to do. Every time I'm not here to hate on phones, but like every time we like, you know, pick up our phone, you know, for maybe the listeners, there's a study that showed that something like 90% of people have felt like a phantom vibration, like they felt like their phone was vibrating or making noise or whatever, and they go and check and there's nothing there. Well, why does that occur? Because we've trained our brain that like, hey, focus and check on this thing a million times. Well, it's the same with other stuff. So to me, it really is. Again, I talked about kind of wrapping Buddhist ideas into kind of modern stuff, is like, one of the ways to train toughness or resilience is literally just sitting. And there's data behind this. You know, one of my favorite studies real quick was they took meditators who were expert at just had spent hours mindfulness. And then they took your average Joe and they just applied a very hot probe to their wrist. And then they looked in their brain with fMRI to see what was happening. Well, the average Joe was freaking out beforehand. They freaked out during it, and then they freaked out afterwards. It just lingered. You looked at the meditators, no stress beforehand. When the probe gets applied, they say, oh, this is hot, but their fear center doesn't go through the roof because they realize that someone's going to take this off and not danger because I'm in a lab. And then after the probe is removed, like they go back down to zero, you know, normal. And like, well, what else is like toughness, resilience, except like maybe not dealing with that physical pain, but it's everything. It's like, well, how do we respond to stress? Well, literally just practicing sitting can do that. And if you don't like the idea of meditation, well, sit there on the train and look out the window. Like, I don't care what you call it or how you do it. Drive in your car without listening to the radio or a podcast or what have you. Like, go on a walk without headphones. Like, be alone in your, you know, and experience the world. And if you do that, that alarm will come down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you said you don't want to hate on phones, but on the back of your book, you've got Cal Newport, who, another just top bloke. He and I were chatting, and actually I spoke to Sam Harris, who said a similar thing around, like, we've never had to be bored before. Now, funnily enough, so tonight I'm due to be going out for a drink with a friend of mine. I haven't seen him, well, I haven't had a drink with him for 3-4 months, maybe longer. And the last time we went out for a drink, I said this exact question to him. I said, when was the last time you were bored? And he couldn't answer. And so I was like, I went to the bar and I said, right, when I go to the bar, just resist that urge to pick up your phone and just sit with it, right? And right there is an opportunity to not distract ourselves, because I think it's so easy, because it's so normalized. You know, you drive down the street now, or walk down the street, everyone's doing that, aren't they? In one form or other, it's like acceptable, although it is an addictive behavior. But like, even just that little moment of, okay, someone's going to the bar, he's not going to be long, I'm not going to look at my phone. I'm just going to sit. There you are. And it's hilarious that we're talking about doing hard things. And perhaps one of the best takeaways, if not the best takeaway, is, hey, sit on your ass and do nothing.
It's hilarious because we think, and again, we think of the hard things as like, oh, I'm going to go, do this crazy exercise or, put myself through this miserable experience. And the hard thing is just literally doing nothing. And I think it actually works. And the other thing is, actually, I was reading a study the other day. So this is in the book, but that looked at, well, does that coping behavior of feeling boredom and then picking up your phone, does that actually help us? And in terms of happiness, levels of sadness, all that, it actually makes us worse. It makes us feel more anxiety. There was a research study that looked at this. So even our coping mechanism fails us, but we keep doing it because it's like the simple behavior that we think makes us feel better. Again, it's that kind of addictive behavior. So, listeners, if you're learning nothing, it's just like find some moments where it's just like you and you're doing nothing, and that will literally make you tougher.
You can't understate, I think, how transformative just being and just sitting can be. We laugh about it, but it really just can be utterly transformative. Right. Last couple of things, Steve. I wanted to ask you about something that in terms of doing hard things, and you don't talk about it at length. I'm not actually sure if it came up hugely, but the importance of hard conversations. So particularly in the UK, in England, sweep things under the carpet. Don't upset the apple cart, leave it alone. And what I've learned in my life is having difficult conversations and sometimes, let's say, getting help with difficult conversations, through therapy or whatever, that is so, so important. And I think one of the bravest things you can do is having hard conversations. There's something you just know is going to be uncomfortable. And I want to give just a quick example. A friend of mine, and I've heard you talk about this actually, about research about people who nearly get divorced, but then don't get divorced. And actually they tend to be happier than the people who do. And a friend of mine was a few years ago going through a difficult time with his wife. And he was like, we can't communicate. And I was like, why don't you get some help with that? Why didn't you get some couples therapy? And he's like, no, we're adults. We should be able to do this. And I'm like, why? I don't remember ever being taught how to have good communications or ever having it modeled. And I know for a fact that you're happy to go and pay good money to work on your golf swing. And trust me, as important as getting your handicap down is, it's not as important as being able to have hard conversations. In terms of hard things, this is another one of those kind of not obvious ones, but navigating hard conversations, which, like all things, gets easier the more you do it.
It's the same thing as everything else we've talked about, is our tendency is to avoid. And whenever you avoid the thing grows, right? The stress around it grows, and you don't solve the actual problem. So I think with the hard conversations, absolutely, we need to go towards them. And I think what it is we're so scared of that stress or pain that we might feel initially from tackling this hard thing, that we avoid it, not realizing that stress and pain from going towards it is temporary. And on the other side of it is often understanding and growth, which over the long haul, leaves us feeling so much better. So it's the short term gets in the way of the long-term benefit. And, maybe to help listeners is, again, I was reading this study that came out not too long ago after the book came out, but it took a hard conversation, which is in America, it took people and it made them from either side of the political spectrum. They made them talk to each other. Okay, which in America is kind of a disaster. So here's what the study found, is that they said that when they just said, hey, you're going to talk to someone from the other side of the political field, or they said, hey, try and learn from someone else, the conversation was a disaster. It didn't go well. They didn't like the other person. Afterwards, they rated it as this was really stressful and horrible. But if they framed instead, when they told these people who signed up for the study, they said, you know what? you're going to have a difficult conversation, and I want you to embrace that and just go towards the difficult parts. What happened is afterwards they reported they didn't agree on everything, but they respected the other person. They saw them as a human being, and they rated the conversation as more productive and beneficial. And that's where I think if we can have that in a political, minefield that is the U.S., then I think that applies to everything else as well, is that a lot of it is the framing. If you have to have that conversation, we'll sit down and be like, hey, this is going to be tough. Like, we need to go towards that. But overall, we're trying to, grow as people, and frame it in that light. We're going to do better. And as you wonderfully said, is if you don't have that ability because you're too close to it, guess what? That's why we have experts. That's why we have therapists. That's why, just like I would coach you on how to, run faster or what have you, or deal with the mental struggle of running, we have people who can do that from a conversation standpoint. So take advantage of that. And I think the world would be so much better if we could embrace that and have those conversations instead of just avoiding them.
Do you know what? Beautifully put, Steve. You're as gifted at talking as you are at writing. And I just think that's such a lovely message in terms of not avoiding, but accepting and even welcoming. And you were talking really in terms of, the external, a Republican and a Democrat, but the same applies inwardly as well, right? And so I think this accept and welcome, don't avoid the message you just said. I think outwardly and inwardly, just the most powerful message. And I just want to finish with a little quote that finishes your book, which is just real toughness is embracing your common humanity. It's not old school toughness. Be who you are. That's real toughness. So that's vulnerability, humility, authenticity, the opposite of the 80s tough guy, Arnie with the muscles. Now forget that. Go and sit in a room and be vulnerable. That's what we're saying here, isn't it?
Spot on. That's the message. It runs a little bit counter to what you might think, but it runs counter because it actually works. And that's where all the research, psychology, everything points to, which is, again, the tough things are often the simplest, which are inwards and in ourselves, is being who we are, being, sitting alone, having those difficult conversations. And if you do that, you're going to be in a good spot.
Steve, it has been sincerely an absolute joy talking to you. I loved your book. There's just so much good stuff in here and so much research. I could see how much work you've put in, and you fully deserve all the amazing people who have lined up to sing your praises. And, and just as I said at the start, I so admire the actions that you've taken in your life as well. So just on every single level, Steve, I tip my cap to you, and it's just been a real pleasure. And I'd love to chat again sometime soon, because it's been lovely. It really has been lovely.
Absolutely. So the same right back at you, Simon. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Life Lessons podcast. I would be delighted to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your guest suggestions, your questions. Just get in touch via my website, simonmundie.com. And if you could share this episode with someone you know or on social media, I would be very grateful, as it does really help people to find this podcast. That's it for now. I will be back with a bite-sized episode this Friday and another full-length episode next week. Until then, goodbye.